Once again, once an extra-line rail line service is subject up to 25 minutes delays between Southern and westbound due to safety issues. New Jersey Transit apologizes for any inconvenience.
Come on. Ha, sicker than your average. Pop a twist cabbage off instinct. Niggas don't think shit stink. Pink gators, my Detroit players. Tim's for my hooligans in Brooklyn. That's dead right.
This is a Rockaway Parkway bound L train.
Oh shit. So how much do you pay for rent in New York?
We pay $28.50 for one bedroom.
And what part of the neighborhood is this in?
Right off the L, right up here.
Just the Jefferson Street station?
DeKalb. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I moved here initially to just have a place to live. Bushwick was the closest neighborhood to the city that I could afford at the time.
She knew Bushwick really well, and she was like, you gotta move to Brooklyn, like Brooklyn's the place to be. So that's kind of how we ended up moving out here.
Why is this the place to be?
I love how diverse and creative and free and authentic this neighborhood is. I mean, it's grown a lot. I feel like when I first moved here, everything was kind of like hidden, like you had to find the little spots where things were happening, and now it's pretty clear there's a lot going on. I think there's more things to do here than there used to be, which is really cool to see.
How have you seen this neighborhood change over time?
Gentrification, obviously.
What do you have to say about that?
You see rent prices increase, people get pushed out, like older businesses because they can't afford the increasing prices. And I mean, it's just like architecturally, it's also interesting to see too. Like over where I live, there's like brownstones and stuff like that. You'll see like the older neighborhoods, and then on the block, at the end of the block, you'll see like these like multi-million-dollar condos, and it's like this doesn't make sense for this area, you know. Traditionally, with black and brown neighborhood, I mean, people are being pushed out, unfortunately. So.
Bushwick is one of New York City's most fascinating and quickly evolving neighborhoods. It's best characterized by its restless nightlife, thriving street art scene, and an increasing amount of young people looking for cheap apartments in a hip, trendy, and well-connected neighborhood. You get some premonition when you come here that this isn't how it always used to be. Giant monoliths of steel and concrete are starting to sprout up in various places across the north of the neighborhood. You begin to notice the new condos and apartment buildings towering over the tired brownstone buildings here, which are increasingly tagged, stickered, and painted over by a newer, younger culture. I wanted to talk to some of the other young people here to see how, when, and why they ended up in the neighborhood. Bushwick is on the front lines of a city that is being rapidly changed by gentrification, so I wanted to come see what gentrification means to different people and the effect that it was having on the neighborhood itself. In order to contextualize why this neighborhood looks the way it does today, we need to go back to the beginning and investigate why the neighborhood was so neglected and underserved in the first place, and what changes are making investors start to send their dollars here. Bushwick of the early 20th century was an industrial working-class town of first-generation immigrants, mostly Germans, Italians, Dominicans, and Puerto Ricans. Like many other urban neighborhoods in the 1930s, Bushwick was subject to redlining, a discriminatory housing policy developed by the federal government's Homeowners Loan Corporation. The redlining process marked neighborhoods with large black, brown, or immigrant populations as undesirable and flagged them as high risk for potential investment. This meant that Bushwick's residents were systematically denied access to certain financial services, and this led to decades of neglect and disinvestment in the neighborhood. Throughout the 60s and 70s, many landlords here began to abandon their properties, which only furthered the neighborhood's decline and accelerated white flight. By the late 20th century, Bushwick, along with most of northern Brooklyn, had become a graveyard of old, decrepit industry and abandoned businesses. But something began to change during the early 2000s, beginning with the burst of the dot-com bubble. Rent prices in Manhattan started to skyrocket. By 2007, Manhattan's rent charted an almost 50% increase over just 7 years. Neighborhoods like Soho, the East Village, Alphabet City, and the Lower East Side, which were historic gathering places for New York City's punks, hipsters, and artists, were simply becoming too expensive for them. Northern Brooklyn was perfectly positioned for this. Rent was significantly cheaper, and it had convenient direct subway access to Manhattan via the L, M, and J trains. Throughout the early to mid-2000s, Northern Brooklyn would become a mecca for young New Yorkers seeking cheap and well-connected housing. Central to this was the 2005 rezoning of the Williamsburg waterfront. which dramatically changed northern Brooklyn's zoning laws. Suddenly, these once neglected industrial buildings could be bought and converted into residential and commercial spaces. New York City developers, eager to capitalize on the low property values of the long-neglected industrial neighborhoods, began pouring capital investment into places like Williamsburg. Over the span of just a decade or two, developers quickly transformed what used to be long-gone industry into the trendy and desirable neighborhood that exists today.
I like being really close to a park, really close to the river. There's a lot of people my age who live here. Most people are in their 20s or 30s. I like the bars and the restaurants. It's kind of a weird place. Everyone's kind of in the same demographic, which is a little weird about it. I lived in the East Village last year, which felt more mixed. It's so much easier to get into a restaurant and sit and stay. It has a slightly alt feel to it, but also kind of a corporate feel to it at the same time. I think there's a lot of tech bros around. I know it's changed historically, massively. Since I've been here, I've only been here for a few months.
We moved here in 2003, so we've been here a long time. This used to be where all my performer friends, my dancer friends lived because it was affordable, and I've just watched this neighborhood go from a place where it was good for artists to completely unaffordable. It really caters to Wall Street families.
It feels like Bushwick is on the same trajectory as Williamsburg was in the early 2000s. As Bushwick's old industrial buildings are being increasingly converted into apartments, event venues, and artist spaces, the neighborhood's property values are increasing with it. Average rents in Bushwick increased approximately 60% between 2000 and 2016, nearly double the citywide rate during that period and reliably outpacing the broader Brooklyn average, driving out longtime residents and making way for those able to keep up with the rising cost of living.
I go to the new school, which is around 14th Street in Lower Manhattan. You can't just get a cheap apartment here. I know students that have gone, live in Upper East Side or Upper West Side. Brooklyn has the proximity because you can still get the train services that can take you to Manhattan and everything. And it's also just the apartments are cheaper and it's better.
I noticed, especially in Manhattan, the amount you're paying for groceries and just for food is pretty astronomical. So
that's another thing. If I'm buying groceries every week, I'm spending on average about upwards of $70, $80 already. That's just how expensive it is. Looking for other places like shopping in even Brooklyn, on average buying weekly groceries, it was $30 less. When it was recommended to me by a couple people, they were talking about a younger generations live there, and the entire scene is just so friendly and also super appealing to me. Not only the art style, but also the music as well, which is a big aspect in my life.
Most of the people I talked to told me a similar story. They were coming to neighborhoods like Bushwick because living in places like Manhattan was simply impossible for them. The general feeling about Manhattan was that it was quickly becoming a place reserved for nepo babies, finance bros, and the ultra-wealthy. The average rent in some Manhattan neighborhoods can easily surpass $5,000 a month, a figure that is completely out of reach for the average New Yorker. The more people I talked to, the more I felt that gentrification was not a process that people maliciously carried out, but more a process that was catalyzed by the shortcomings of the system itself. In a city where less and less landlords are willing to offer rent-stabilized housing, New Yorkers everywhere are struggling to find financially sustainable accommodations. And this is especially dangerous during a time where many people are struggling just to make ends meet.
I think morally no one really wants to actively displace people. So I'm curious what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I don't know if you would call me a gentrifier because I moved here 6 years ago. So. Sure. For me, obviously, I don't come here with the intention. I don't think a lot of people come here being yes, I want to kick the people who lived here out. And at the end of the day, money talks. Money's what makes the world go round. If people are willing to pay more, you're going to end up with bidding wars. That's kind of what happens here in New York. It's a very dog eats dog world, very cutthroat when it comes to the housing market specifically. People think that they're making places better, but I think also it's cultural erasure at the same time.